that going to,
All right. Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to those of you who are in the room and those of you that are listening virtually. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Tony Berry, and I have the honor of leading the FitzSimons Presidential Initiative on Civics and Civility here at Fordham University. Tonight is our inaugural event for that initiative, and you'll hear more details shortly about what that initiative is and what our vision for it is. First, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for this evening's conversation. So prior to her role at Fordham and in higher education, she was a dedicated public servant. So topics around civic engagement and civil discourse are extremely important to her. Among several hats she's worn throughout her career, she was a Harry S. Truman Fellow and an assistant U.S. attorney in New Orleans, Louisiana. She served the community of New Orleans in a variety of roles after Hurricane Katrina, including on the Civil Service Commission, where she helped make the city government there more effective and efficient. Thankfully for us, she brought her talents to the world of Jesuit higher education, first as the president of Loyola New Orleans in 2018, and then swapping the Big Easy for the Big Apple, she took the helm here at Fordham in 2022. So please join me in welcoming the 33rd president of Fordham University, Tania Tetlow.
So I don't know about you, but I love civics more than anything in the whole world. When I turned 18, I registered to vote at the minute the office opened, and I was so excited that I misspelled my own middle name. I reversed the letter, so you can still find me on the voter rolls there with the wrong middle name. I became a scholar focused on the Constitution and issues of race and equality. And so this, to me, seems like the most exciting thing to study in the world. But we know from data that for the first time in decades, knowledge of civics, understanding of the levers of democracy has begun to fade. And with that, the willingness to engage in democracy. It takes a leap of faith to believe that your one vote of millions will matter to the universe. And so you really need to understand why it matters in order to participate. And so the forces that would disrupt democracy want us to be cynical, want us to not care, want us to not pay attention. And that is the enemy we face, that we, for the first time in forever, have the very real possibility that we could lose what is most precious about our country and our systems, and we see that happening around the world. And so Dennis FitzSimons has donated this project of really having us at Fordham pay attention, to wake up, to think about what matters to us. And so we have many of you in this room and many more watching online of helping us with brilliant speakers, with engagement on campus, to do more to really know who we are and why it matters. So as our inaugural speaker, couldn't think of a better person than John Dickerson. So he is about to become the co-anchor of CBS Evening News and take the chair once held by Walter Cronkite. No pressure, John. Walter Cronkite, who probably would not even be able to believe what has become of modern journalism and all the ways that it too has been disrupted and how that interacts with our democracy. I can shorten the introduction by saying he's had all the jobs at CBS, from Face the Nation to Sunday Morning, so many things. He started at Time and then Slate, then broadcast journalism at the most esteemed of our networks. He may be the only, or at least the first, major journalist at CBS who follows there in the footsteps of his mother. Nancy Dickerson was the first on-air reporter at CBS, covering presidential campaigns and politics from 1960 on. John grew up in Washington in the 70s and 80s, but has a far longer historical memory because of his mother than most. So he has written a couple of books about presidential campaigns and the presidency. He also wrote a book that I couldn't put down called In Her Trail, about his mother. It tells the fascinating story of her brilliant, flawed, fearless ambition. And it's also the most human of stories about children and their parents. So go out immediately and read it. John brings to us the insights of his own Catholic faith, steeped in the Jesuits. He is a beloved friend of our own Father Jim Martin, and his deep knowledge of American history and the levers of democracy make him the perfect person to talk with journalistic curiosity about where we're heading and what we face today. Thank you, John.
Thank you, President Tetlow. I'm reading this off of my iPad, so if anything goes wrong, it's the iPad's fault. Thank you all very much for being here, and for the legions out there in the virtual world. Thank you. Let's see if I can do this without glasses. I'm here today to talk about democracy and political discourse, and if we don't have healthy political discourse, then we don't have a healthy democracy. Today, of course, it all feels a little out of joint, that political discourse. It's loud, sometimes to the point of violence, which was precisely the reason we have a democracy, which was to stop the violence, to thwart the violence by the process of collective debate. But at the moment, many of us feel our voices, whether in the public square or at Thanksgiving, are either lost in the noise or picked apart. We're misinterpreted, we're accused of meanings we didn't intend, or we're drowned out, and sometimes it feels like nobody is truly listening. And thinking about this assignment, and by the way, it may end up being more of a speech than a conversation, so strap in. I was reminded of my favorite story of political discourse, which is a member of the British Parliament stood to speak on the very first time since he'd been elected. Now, the House of Commons, which traces its history back to the 13th century, is a pretty intimidating place. It's also, the worn leather chamber is also smaller than the total membership of the House of Commons. There are 427 seats, but there are 650 members. And Churchill, even after it was destroyed after World War II, designed it or wanted it to stay close, as he said, a sense of the crowd and urgency in the room during important debates. And so this nervous first-term member about to stand up in this august place stood, and in the House of Commons, of course, your opposition is standing right across from you, and just as he was about to push out his first word, somebody from the opposition shouted, "Resign!" So it feels like that way in our political discourse at the moment. Healthy political discourse, public discourse is vital to democracy because America is founded on ideas that require debate and refinement that comes from talking, from arguing. Now, why is that? Well, first, as you all know, America was founded on ideas, and an intellectual argument separated America in its inception from a hereditary regime with the Declaration of Independence. A set of ideas became the rules, the Constitution, and those ideas, while they were sometimes ignored in the very document of the Constitution, were nevertheless strong enough. Those ideas of freedom and liberty were strong enough to survive and improve the original promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, long after those original framers gathered in Philadelphia in 1787. A story about the power of ideas and how they lived on after all those white men were dead. The Civil Rights Movement is a perfect example of how these founding ideas, though imperfectly implemented, became the centerpiece of societal change. Men and women like John Lewis marched and sacrificed for those ideas, propelled by those ideas into real violence. Lewis famously, I'm sure you've seen the picture of him standing at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. What you often don't see in the picture is the dogs and the police who are on the other side of him. In that picture, he's wearing a backpack, and when I interviewed Congressman Lewis, I asked him what was in that backpack. He had packed the backpack with an orange, a toothbrush, and 2 books because he knew he would be arrested that night for trying simply to march peacefully for his own right to vote in a country where that was supposed to not be a question. And he wanted to be prepared to spend his night in jail. What we all now know is that he spent his night in the hospital because a billy club caved in part of his skull and he would have those scars for the rest of his life. One of the books in the backpack was Thomas Merton's 7-Story Mountain. The Trappist monk wrote about his path to Christianity, and the other book was The American Political Tradition by Richard Hofstadter. Merton's book contained the story of Christ's love that was at the center, an idea, at the center of what was propelling Lewis and the rest of them, their nonviolent, Christian-based march for their own freedoms. The Hofstadter book starts with this quote from John Dos Passos. "In times of change and danger, when there is a quicksand of fear under one's reasoning, a sense of continuity with generations before can stretch like a lifeline across the scary present." The books in Lewis's backpack weren't just reading material, they were ammunition in the battle of ideas. By carrying Merton and Hofstadter with him on the front lines of the civil rights movement, Lewis demonstrated the power of ideas and that they required not just belief, but active defense and promotion through discourse, and even in the face of violence. That political discourse that is the topic of our conversation today. America thrives from the continuity of ideas that Dos Passos wrote about from one generation to another. As the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of Frederick Douglass, David Blight, put it, democracy requires us to love ideas more than ourselves. The power of ideas to influence action is what made America so truly revolutionary in its moment. That's why King George III, when he heard that George Washington willingly gave up power as commander of the Continental Army, handed over power back to the people's representatives, the politicians, that the general had put the ideas of this new crazy place ahead of his own fortunes. King George III reportedly told the American-born artist Benjamin West, "If Washington does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." So ideas freely expressed that win out in debate can change a nation, can change lives. So you need a system of public debate to handle those ideas. You want to be able to understand the person you're talking to that's not like you, because that's how progress is made. And the people in America weren't going to be like you by design. It was supposed to be a diverse country, not a country built on heredity or where you were born, who your parents were, or where you were born, but based on a shared love of freedom. And that diversity was going to make America a better place. Well, it has over slow and difficult progress. Rights have expanded to women, blacks, members of the LGBTQ community, and that is all through talking. That is all through the public discourse that we're here to talk about today. And as students at Fordham, of course, you're part of that ongoing conversation about America's ideas. You discuss in classrooms and dorms. Every time you have those conversations, you're continuing this tradition of a country founded on ideas. So let's explore some of the ways in which we can rescue ourselves from this current moment through public discourse that's so vital to a democracy that's built on the power of ideas and on diversity. But before we get to that, we have to talk about the impediments, because there is a significant impediment we're all up against, those of us who would like to have this civic discourse in a way that would produce or protect the ideas of America. Our ability to, everybody here is familiar with algorithms, right, and social media. They watch our behavior, and then they feed us content that keeps us engaged. Often that content outrages us. We get hooked on the outrage, and so the structure of social media undermines the discourse, and I could give a whole speech on that, but I'm not going to. Because there's a political version of the social media algorithm where the structure of political life in America, the political algorithm, if you will, makes it harder to have good arguments that are necessary and a part of that tradition that I just laid out. So I'm going to talk about the ecosystem in our political life, and politics is supposed to be the system through which we have these discussions that creates, or at least maintains, American values. So before I depress you thoroughly, I'm going to tell you a happy story. It's 1983. The president, a Republican, is Ronald Reagan. The Speaker of the House is Tip O'Neill. He's a Democrat. They weren't just two leaders of their party. They represented opposing ideologies. Reagan championed anti-government conservatism and free markets as a way to grow that America I talked about before, that land of ideas, while O'Neill, an FDR Democrat, believed government's role would help. Government played a significant role in realizing the American dream. And when they fought, these two giants of their teams, it got quite heated. O'Neill, as many of you here know, was a bit of a heavy-set man. Reagan would say that he got his exercise by jogging 3 times around Tip O'Neill. Because Reagan believed that O'Neill had promoted too much government spending by the government, he compared O'Neill to Pac-Man, a round thing that gobbles up money. O'Neill, for his part, said that Reagan was lazy. He said he only works 3 to 3.5 hours a day. He doesn't do his homework. He doesn't read his briefing papers. It's sinful that this man is president of the United States. So this all sounds very familiar. This is what you can turn on cable and see every day. The most contentious issue of the day was Social Security, which was going bankrupt. The retirement program for the elderly was running out of money, and so you had these two men who fought in this contentious way, representing two different ideologies, had to come up with a solution. Now, as you all may remember, Social Security, for those of you who are subway riders, is known as the third rail of politics, which means that if you or your political party touches or messes with Social Security, that will be the end of your life and perhaps the end of your political party's life. So the stakes were high for these two combatants. And yet, ultimately, over time, the two of them came to an agreement about how to reform Social Security so that it is still with us today, though maybe not for long, given the budget projections. This is now considered the gold standard for modern productive political discourse. How much is it considered that? Well, here are some headlines. 2009, bipartisan Reagan-O'Neill Social Security deal in 1983 showed it can be done. 2010, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, a model for breaking partisan gridlock. 2015, how Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan would make Congress work. 2017, The New Yorker, can Donald Trump learn from Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill? And 2021, lessons from Reagan and O'Neill, cooperation in a divided era. So the headline writers are not wrong about what happened in 1983. This is the way politics is supposed to work. They're not wrong about that. But the problem with this pretty story is that the current system of politics makes it nearly impossible for this to happen today. So Reagan and O'Neill were able to work together in part because they actually were friendly when they weren't insulting each other. O'Neill used to say, politics is politics, and at 5 o'clock, we're friends again. And Reagan used to joke that sometimes when O'Neill was misbehaving, he would set his watch to 5 o'clock to hasten that moment. They were both Irish. They liked Irish stories. They enjoyed their shared heritage. But the real reason Reagan and O'Neill worked together is based on the structure of politics. When Ronald Reagan won the presidency in 1980, there were 85 congressional districts across the country where the voters in those congressional districts voted for Democrats for the House of Representatives. So you had people who voted for a House member who was a Democrat, but they voted for a president who was a Republican. Now, politicians mostly do things to please their voters. So for 85 Democrats, in order to please their voters, they had to keep in mind, and keep at the front of their mind, the fact that their voters had voted for a Republican president. And of course, the Republican president had to know that if he wanted to get reelected, he had to think about all those districts, 85 and really more, where the voters there believed in the Democratic Party's traditions and ideas. If he wanted to get reelected, he needed to keep the Democrats in mind. Now, a further little wrinkle is that O'Neill had his job as Speaker because the members of the House, the Democrats, because they were in the majority, voted him to be Speaker. So if those Democrats were going to vote him to be Speaker, he had to be nice to those 85 Reagan Democrats who he wanted to make him the most powerful person either in Washington or certainly in Congress. So for those who may have lost all of that math, imagine, this is another way this might work in practice. Imagine there are 10 people deciding which restaurant to go to for dinner. 3 of them prefer the steakhouse, they're meat lovers. 7 are vegetarians. So on the surface, it would seem like, well, if you've got 7 vegetarians and 3 people who love meat, we're going to a vegetarian restaurant. But it turns out that some of the vegetarians are enticed by the famous steakhouse in Omaha. So some of those vegetarians are going to eat meat. So consequently, based on the preferences at the moment, the group opts for the steakhouse, which offers fewer vegetarian options, but the balanced choice satisfies the largest part of the group because it satisfies the meat lovers, it satisfies the vegetarians who occasionally cheat and have some meat now and again. The only group that kind of gets a little shut out is the pure vegetarians who are bummed because how much salmon can you eat, because salmon's the only thing they ever offer in a steakhouse for the vegetarians. But those vegetarians don't define their entire life by what they eat. They'd rather be with the group. And so they're happy to go along in this. The meal may not be the perfect one, but they're happy to be dining with them. So what I've just described is known as split ticket voting, a situation where the voters of different parties vote for different parts of the shared power system in America. It's gone away, pretty much. In 1996, there were 108 of these districts where you had members of Congress who were in a different party than the president. That was in 1996. In 2016, that dropped to 35. And in 2020, it dropped to 16. In the Senate, same thing. During Nixon and Reagan's period, you had Republican presidents who were elected in states where half of those states had Democratic senators. So a Republican president has to work with the Democratic senator because the people who voted for him also voted for a Democratic senator. And Democratic senators didn't get any joy from their voters if they just had gratuitous attacks on a Republican president that those Democratic voters had voted for. In 2016, there was not a single state in which you had a senator who was not from the party of the president who won that state. Gone. Split ticket voting gone in the Senate. So put plainly, that means there are fewer members of one party of Congress who feel pressure from their voters to work with a president of the opposite party. So now imagine 10 people deciding to eat. 7 are vegetarians, 3 prefer steakhouses. But there are no vegetarians who like steak. They don't even whisper that they've ever liked steak. So guess where you're going to eat? You're going to the vegetarian place. The steak people are out of luck. A few more figures to drive this home. In 1960, 50%, half of all lawmakers overlapped ideologically with their others. That means there were things like liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. So 50% were overlapping. Now, doesn't exist. The most conservative Democrat in Congress is more liberal than the most liberal Republican House member. The most liberal Republican is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. There is no more overlap. So what happened to the vegetarians who liked steak? Well, the vegetarians increasingly didn't want to hang out with those people anymore because they decided that meat was unethical, harms the environment, and the steak eaters were equally harsh. They don't want to hang out with the woke vegetarians. People who used to not really care that much about dining choice decided when they were participating in the political system that that was going to be the defining decision about where they would want to eat. So why did this happen? And just to remind you, we're talking about the structure of politics that makes that political discourse in a democracy so difficult. Why did this happen? Money, movement, and media. First, money. To run for office, you need it. In 2012, to run for the House, it cost $1.5 million. It now costs $2.7 million. That's a 78% increase in what you have to spend. In the Senate, in 2012, it cost $11.4 million to run for the Senate and win. It costs $26 million now to win. That's a 131% increase. How do you raise money? Two ways. First, has anybody here ever gotten a fundraising email by a campaign? And what's the nature of the discourse in that campaign letter? Dear John, my opponent has a point on Social Security. No. Dear John, my opponent is going to eat cats, right? This is something politics shares with social media. Outrage drives the dollars. The second thing that you need when you're running and you need that much money is you attach yourself to national issues, because there are enormous national organizations that funnel money to candidates who care about those issues. So for the left, it's reproductive rights. For the right, it's opposition to trans rights. And if you are running, you need access to that money. So you may not actually care about those issues, but by caring about those issues, or appearing to anyway, you will get access to that money, which means now everybody is aligned in these big fights. You might agree to have on 80% of things, but when it comes to dinner, and that's the number one choice, you're either a vegetarian or you're a meat eater. So it sorts people because of the desire and need for money. Now, what's another way to raise money is you become popular in your party. You go on TV. There are now places that people can go on in each party they can go on TV, and you've seen them on TV. It's not unlike those fundraising letters. The people who get recognized on television often say things that are outrageous. What's the result of all of this outrage? Well, we have a more negative view of the people on the other side who we've been telling ourselves are totally outrageous. So, 72% of Republicans now view Democrats as more immoral than other Americans. In 2016, that number was just 47%. 63% of Democrats see Republicans as more immoral. That's a rise from 35%. Here's an interesting one. In 1958, the Gallup organization asked a random sample of Americans, if you had a daughter, it's 1958, if you had a daughter of marriageable age, would you prefer she marry a Democrat or a Republican, all other things being equal? 33% of Eisenhower-era Democrats wanted their daughters to marry a Democrat. 25% of Republicans wanted their daughters to marry a Republican. By 2016, 60% of Democrats and 63% of Republicans wanted only inter-party marriage. The independents apparently were left out. Maybe they're not getting married. So when we feel this way about the other side that we've been told to be outraged about, we put our political opinions at the center of our lives. We feel political conflict now personally. This goes back to the people who used to go to dinner and didn't really care what they were going to eat. Now we feel it personally. Studies have been done where issues that you disagree with, people will pay money not to be confronted with issues they disagree with. That it's become a personal, the fight or flight reflex kicks in now as a result of the way people think about politics. So this has been, this feeling about human beings in the other party now is reflected in the ideas we debate. In 1994, the Pew Research Center started testing broad questions to Democrats and Republicans. So like, do regulations do more harm than good? Are black Americans facing a systematic racism? Are immigrants a burden to society? And the other one was whether corporations make reasonable profits. In that year of 1994, basically the parties were split by about 15 points in their opinions on those kind of basic democratic questions. 30 years later, 40 points divide the two parties. So we've gone from the way the parties think about individuals in the other party to now a massive split on the ideas associated with those parties and the way people think about them. So And that partisan gap of 40 points is larger than the gap between the opinions of men and women, black and white Americans, and other different socioeconomic groups. It's the biggest disruptor by party. So on the question, a couple of examples of whether racial discrimination is the main reason many black people can't get ahead, the partisan gap on that question was minimal. Democrats and Republicans essentially felt the same way in 1994. In 2021, about 74% of Democrats believed racial discrimination is the main reason many black people can't get ahead, while only 9% of Republicans felt that way. That's a 65-point gap. Why does that matter? Because if you don't believe this thing even exists, you can't have a debate about policies or ideas to address the thing that only 9% think exist in the world. In 1994, both parties basically had similar views on immigration. In 2021, 83% of Democrats said immigrants strengthen the country because of their hard work and talents. 38% of Republicans agreed. That's a 45-point gap. So these increasingly negative views about policy, about other people, started to affect the places we actually lived. So this is called the big sort, and it started really to kick in about 50 years ago. So that means I want to live around people who are like Republicans, or I want to live around people who are like Democrats. And when this happens, you can't find a vegetarian restaurant in a red meat town. 1976, 25% of Americans lived in what are called landslide counties. That means geographical areas where one party just wipes out the other party because there's so many of them. Now, right now, 58% of Americans live in areas where it's so polarized that one party just wallops and wipes out the other side. Again, another structural way in which the discourse is shaped, because the discourse often goes through politics, is shaped by these numbers. You don't live around anybody, or you live around very few people who have a different view than you do. So in these kinds of counties, the 58% counties, the political contest doesn't then become between two parties. It gets fought in primaries. It's a fight that then becomes among the people of the same party. And that tends to lead opinions in the party over to the side, over to the more extreme side. So it's vegetarians against vegans. It's meat eaters against raw meat eaters. 20 years ago, there were 75 to 100 districts out of the 435 in Congress where the voters might pick a Democrat or a Republican. 75 to 100 of those districts, where it was up for grabs. Now there are about 30 or 40. Which means all the rest are mostly defined by or driven by these primaries. If there's a primary at all, because of the power of incumbency, you have people who just stay in their jobs. So it's not just that there are no vegetarians going to dinner with the meat eaters. The situation is that the meat eaters are only eating raw and wriggling meat when they go to dinner. And the vegetarians, if you are seen having formerly hung out with a meat eater, you're no longer invited back to dinner with the vegetarians. So these are the political obstacles in a system that drive us away from the kind of discourse that we want and that's so necessary in the political process as defined by our founders and as affirmed over the years by progress made through political discourse. So back to the purpose of our speech, what are we going to do about it? The reason I went through all of that is to explain kind of what I was feeling in 2012 when I was on the campaign trail, which was that the mechanism for turning ideas into policies or affirming American values through public debate was kind of very warped. And because our environment in the media sees public questions so much through the political lens, that meant that we were basically conveying this warping in our public questions through the work that I was doing. And that was pretty depressing. And so I traced my thoughts that I'll get into in a moment, which is about how we can fix this, to back to Thomas Merton. This was before I interviewed Congressman Lewis, but in 2012, while I was covering the presidential campaign and sleeping in a different hotel every evening, I started to listen to Merton's conferences to the novices at Gethsemane, at the monastery in which he taught them for many, many years. And what Merton is concerned with mostly is helping these young novices fight distraction, because their job is to spend time in contemplation, in silence, in meditation, basically thinking about God. And they get distracted because our brains are built to be, to distract us. And so Merton is very intentional about how they can fight distraction and how they then can, once they've fought distraction, focus on basically praying to God. And he literally repeats the lessons of St. John Cassian about how, when there are individual incursions and distractions, how to basically do this sort of mind trick where you turn the distraction into a prayer. He's talking to them in the sort of very basic operation of the brain to try to get them to both not be distracted and to focus on the task at hand. And so I thought, well, we have a version of that, essentially, with what we do. What those of us who engage in public debate share with the novices is that we too are under a constant assault of distractions. Like the monks were confronted with doubt, like the monks were constantly trying to get back on task, those of us who are engaged in public affairs or in public debate. And like the monks, some of us would be better off if we maintained a vow of silence. Just a little finer point on the methods of distraction. Anybody who's on social media knows about the level of distraction that we feel, but the incursions from the outside come from every possible avenue. I mean, every inducement to buy in our consumer culture is pinging us. Music and movies can now be seen everywhere. You can order food or anything else you want right to you. There are so many different things to feed your appetites and distract you from the kind of thinking that's required to handle these hard issues and engage in this public process of debate. According to a recent piece of research, people now interrupt themselves approximately every 47 seconds on average when working on digital devices. So how do you have, going back again to the monks, how do you spend your time on important issues, having a good debate, overcoming all of those political obstacles I mentioned, if you've only got 47 seconds of attention to apply to it? And of course, this creates pathways in the brain, right? So even when a notification isn't coming in, you start to feel like maybe a notification might have come in that you missed. So then maybe you check your phone. So some of you right now are feeling like, well, he's talking about the phone all the time. I wonder what's on my phone. And you might just like start to vibrate in your seats if I keep talking about the phone so much. My favorite story about that, about distraction and not letting it be taken and keeping your eye on task is that Hank Aaron, when he was playing for the Milwaukee Braves, was up at bat, and Yogi Berra, the famous Yankee, was the catcher, and he said, Hank, you got to turn your bat so you can read the label. And Aaron didn't listen to him. And Berra said, no, Hank, come on, you gotta turn the label so you can read it. And Hank Aaron didn't say anything. And then he started a third time, and finally Aaron shot back. He said, I didn't come up here to read, I came up here to hit. And that's our job, is to not get distracted but keep the eye on the ball. Because effective political discourse, the lifeblood of a democracy, requires the same stuff that Merton was talking about. Staying focused on core issues, not getting sidetracked by distractions. Finding a system for turning mental incursions, those distractions, like knee-jerk partisan reactions that we've been poked at to have by all of the fundraising emails and the talk radio and everything else that's doing it. We've got to turn those kinds of incursions into thoughtful reflection. And we've got to be incredibly intentional about this, because if we're not intentional, all those different kinds of interruptions are going to take over our thinking, because who has the willpower to fight them all? So let's go through some specific lessons that I think are useful and that are based really on my reading and interviewing people who've thought even longer and harder about this than I have. First is to remind ourselves, as I tried to earlier, about why healthy political discourse is important. It's the way progress is made in a democracy, and ideas need to be debated and sharpened. And if the process of sharpening those ideas, of discussing those ideas, becomes poison, then the democracy will too. Second is that good ideas come from being tested, even if they've been around for a while, and the test has to be legitimate. If it is not fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, it will be held as a dead dogma, said the philosopher John Stuart Mill. A dead dogma and not a living truth. But what does it mean to have legitimate discourse? What are the rules if we're going to follow Thomas Merton and be incredibly intentional about this? What does it require? It requires three things, and I'm stealing now, although I'm giving him credit, to Jonathan Rauch, who wrote a book called The Constitution of Knowledge, which you should all go out and read. It's fantastic, and it lays out beautifully where he basically argues you need a structure for these kinds of debates and conversations, political discourse, the subject of our talk tonight. He says you need to build a structure, and that structure needs to have basically three things. And this is a positive structure to fight that other structure I talked about that's in the political system. The first is freedom of speech. It's important that people be able to expand what they say, even dumb, bad, offensive ideas. They need to be tested. Take some risks, cross some lines, because you don't know where the line is until you cross it. Because free speech is how minds are changed. Frederick Douglass said, if there had been free speech, slavery would have melted away after 5 years. John Lewis, who I mentioned earlier, said that the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings had it not been for free speech. Now, free speech on its own is not enough, as any of you who've gone on Twitter know. You need the discipline of fact. And what that means is it's not just that things have to be true, but that argument and reason have to be based on fact, not emotion or tribe or race or gender or my truth and your truth. Conversation needs to be formed around a search for truth, which means striving for clarity. That's the purpose of the conversation, not just that you marshal facts, but that's your goal. And then the final one is diversity of viewpoints, which freshen and sharpen existing views, or if those views are found dull and out of date, then the new diverse viewpoint, which is better and more in concert with the values of the community, replaces them. So those are the three conditions. And by the way, if you practice them in your personal life, it might even lead to a more meaningful personal life, regardless of what it might do for the benefits of political discourse. So in the concluding part of the speech, everything I say will basically be in the service of those three goals. The first is to step out of your frame. So what do I mean by that? Well, that long discussion I gave about the political system, that you have to know that that exists and to resist it, to get out of it. Because what it's feeding you is what is the political system is interested in, but that's interested in maintaining and gaining power. And that may not be what you're interested in unless you're a hard partisan. But the point of this speech is to try to reclaim public discourse, not just tell you how to do more of what we already have, which many people find so unsatisfying. So you need to know how to get out of, or at least work to get out of that political system that is trapping us. The same is true, of course, of social media, and to get out of the algorithms that trap us in that as well. So recognize the system you're in and work to get out of it. And that also means check your own thinking to make sure that that you aren't disagreeing with somebody because you've lapsed into a kind of tribe response, that the people around you who influence you or the party you belong to are driving your response and not your own thinking. And I swear I know artificial intelligence is supposed to be awful and we're all going to be reporting to the robots soon, but one of the best ways for me in the work that I do is to use artificial intelligence to take things I believe, arguments I've written, essays I've written, and say, find the holes in this. Assume the voice of a liberal, a conservative, a MAGA Republican, and attack it from all of those points of view. It's a wonderful way to shock yourself out of your own blind spots, which we all have, to puncture your own confirmation biases. And the point is not to replace your own thinking, but just to poke at it, and sufficiently poked, your brain will start thinking in a way that helps you get out of those patterns of thinking that we have and that we've been put in by the variety of systems that make us respond to issues in patterns rather than with our own thinking. The second thing is work on your own house. Now that you've got yourself out of the political frame and out of the algorithms of the social media, you have to use that free time, all that great free time you're spending with your phone on silent, building your own system. And that means working towards something like what Merton's monks used to do, okay? You're not distracted. What are you going to spend your meditative time on? Well, whatever it is that you care about. And that means being intentional in the work that you do, and I would suggest two things in thinking through what you believe. The first is to ask why, which sounds super simple, but it is amazing how many people sashay into debate without knowing why they believe what they believe. And in my business, read a news story or watch something on TV, and then after they say something or make an assertion, just ask, why is that the case? And see if they've told you. Why did gas prices go down after the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Why will the Fed's rate decision lower your car loan bill? Why are eggs expensive? Why are more teenagers getting addicted to online gambling? You will find frustratingly quickly that you often don't know. How many times have you been with somebody who tells you a great story and you go, oh, that's really amazing. Why'd that happen? and they have no idea because they haven't been told. Well, fortunately, there's a wonderful world of research out there that you can do because you're using your own frame and not a political frame. You will do the research with an open mind to help you understand the why of things. And the second thing is to, one other thing on the asking of why. Another anecdote that used to be told by the former Mississippi governor and chairman of the Republican Party, Haley Barbour. He used to say in these kinds of situations, when you're being distracted, the idea, and this goes back to the Hank Aaron story, keep the main thing the main thing. In 1970, Conrad Hilton, who was the founder of Hilton Hotels, was asked by Johnny Carson, the talk show host, what piece of advice he would give the American people. And Conrad Hilton, the founder of the famous hotel chain, said, "Please put the shower curtain inside the tub." So the point of that was, even at the head of this massive hotel empire, Hilton was focused on the main thing, the simple details that directly affected the guest experience. Keeping the shower curtain inside prevents the water from going over the bathroom floor. You don't slip on it. The guest is more comfortable. The maids don't have to clean it up. And it reminds that if you keep asking why, it actually doesn't necessarily diffuse you into a million different corners, but it sometimes can get you to focus on the main thing. So the why helps us understand the underlying reasons behind whatever it is we believe, and that there are profound impacts, even from tiny little things like not keeping the shower curtain in the tub. The second is to seek understanding and not just knowledge. What do I mean? What does that distinction mean? Knowledge is something like memorizing all the items on a recipe. To understand is to be able to improvise a dish from scratch. So knowledge is fragile, understanding is supple. So if you're armed with mere knowledge, when a contradiction arises, you have no framework for evaluating that contradiction in the light of the new information. So if the recipe calls for buttermilk and you don't have buttermilk, you're sunk. If you have just knowledge. If you have understanding, you understand why buttermilk is used, the acidity, and you can replace the buttermilk by mixing milk with lemon juice or vinegar to create the similar acidic environment. Someone who's memorized that World War I started in 1914 has knowledge. Someone who's memorized and or someone who understands the complex web of alliances, nationalism, militarism, and other that led to the war can now engage in a meaningful discussion about the current currents in our world and how they may map onto that history. One more on this realm of why and knowledge. The science fiction writer Isaac Asimov said, "The actual phrase of scientific discovery is not eureka, but that's odd." Now, implicit in connecting scientific discovery with "that's odd" is that the person who thought "that's odd" thought, why is that happening? Why is that odd? And follows the chain of why until they actually discover something. So this will help you in your effort to improve public discourse. And also understanding why, if you do it well, helps you explain yourself to other people, which is the section of our conversation we're going to get into now, which is how do you have these wonderful views that you have and translate them into a human experience with others who might not agree with you. So I think of discussion and debate in this instance like an equalizer. So you've worked on your understanding of what you believe, you've gotten yourself out of the frame that's been polluting public discourse, and for those of you who aren't familiar with an equalizer, it's basically a set of different sliding scales that together make up sound. So you have one for bass, one for treble, one for the mid-range, and you adjust each of them and it contributes to the final sound. So for example, in discourse, we might say that one of those scales is humility. So that's something we want to have. When arguing with a fool, make sure that your opponent isn't doing the same thing. And why do you want to do this? Well, you want to be open to other viewpoints. You don't want to assume bad motives, because again, our goal here is not to follow the frame and system of politics, which assumes bad motives of people on the other side. But of course, you don't want to be so humble that you lose your moral judgment or are too weak to make your point. So don't be a jerk if you're arguing with your neighbor, but if you're arguing with Hitler, you can be a jerk. And the reason I use the equalizer analogy is that you have to figure these things out on the fly. And so you want to set the levels as you enter into conversation. So if you feel like somebody, you're not going to judge them on their motives, You're not going to prejudge them before they start talking. But if after a while they start talking and you realize that you're not getting anywhere because they are what Amanda Ripley likes to call a conflict entrepreneur, that they are engaged in the process of discourse for the purpose of just creating conflict, then you're wasting your time, and that could be spent more productively. And I should say that Amanda Ripley's book, which I would also add to Jonathan Rauch's, her book is called High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out, which is a study of these ideas and how to have better conversations, how to have good conflict, which is the more constructive, resolvable disagreements that are the centerpiece of democracy. So back to humility. That's also something you can practice. So get used to being wrong, to experiencing the sort of itchy sweater feeling of having to change your mind or maybe have to endure ideas that challenge you. This is slightly different, a slightly different context, but the comedian Stephen Colbert, when he was first starting out, he started in improv. And in improv, you have to be okay with making an ass of yourself on stage. And the looser you are and the more you have removed your ego, the better you will be to live in the moment and say the funny things. And so to practice being embarrassed, he would go into crowded elevators and face in the corner and then just start singing at the top of his lungs so that he could become comfortable with the unpleasant feeling of everybody staring at him and thinking he was crazy. And once he became habituated to being able to get through that, he was able to be looser on stage, and even when he flopped, he was feeling okay. So humility is a thing that we can, and anybody here who has a religious practice, there is often humility discussed, at least in some quarters, when it comes to religious practice, so that's one possible route. So I should probably tie off this one point about humility with a little more specificity. I once interviewed the physicist Carlo Rovelli, who was like Richard Feynman in that he has a particular talent for explaining very complex ideas of physics to people like me. And I asked him about being wrong, and he said, you know, Einstein is perhaps the greatest mind in physics of, you know, maybe ever. And he said, Einstein was wrong all the time. And the lesson I took from that is that, and this is true throughout all science, is that when you're wrong in science, that's great, you've learned something. You're not bent out of shape by it. You've learned something, and now you'll go careen off and learn something else. So if you can't think like a scientist, then think like Ben Franklin, who at the very end of the Constitutional Convention, he wasn't quite thrilled with the Constitution, but he stood, in fact, he didn't stand because he couldn't stand, but he had read to the group, and this is at the very end. This is what he said: I confess that there are several parts of the Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I'm not sure I shall never approve them, for having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions, even on important subjects, which I once thought right, but found to be otherwise. It is therefore that the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment, and to pay more respect to the judgment of others. Most men, indeed, as well as most sects in religion, think themselves in possession of all truth, and that wherever others differ from them, it is so far error. Few express it so naturally as a certain French lady, who in a dispute with her sister said, I don't know how it happens, sister, but I meet with nobody but myself that is always in the right. So in society, we need to revere Einstein. We need to revere Franklin, or Churchill, who said, those who never change their minds never change anything. The political system I was talking about earlier holds up people, never change, never flip-flop. You're not allowed to do that. It holds up in certain quarters people who are always certain, right? Certain and wrong will beat weak and right, Bill Clinton famously said. So what are the other settings on the equalizer? I'll go through them quickly. Empathy. So we want to strive to understand the other person, in part because it lowers those barriers that come when you've got a hot argument. If you listen and hear and empathize with the other person, it's much more likely that they are going to listen to what you might have to say. It's also just the human thing to do. Also, empathy helps you hear, and if you hear, you might actually learn something, and you might be the one that has to change your mind. And if you're thinking like a scientist, you should welcome the chance to change your mind, because you don't want to go blundering around the world with the wrong opinion. So Restraint is another really important thing. I did this today, and I want to pat myself on the back. I did not respond to an email. Not every email must be responded to. Not every point that someone says has to be rebutted. Sometimes just let it go by. Complexity. It's not weakness to recognize complexity. Most of the issues that we cover, or that we cover, I'm talking about the press, but it's true, we flatten things, make them binary issues. Most things in public life are puzzles that have interlocking parts that are complicated. To recognize that is not a sign of weakness, though it is in that political system that I was talking about earlier. And finally, and by the way, you can just embrace complexity by saying sometimes, maybe, it depends. These are words that allow for a world in which it's not all perfectly clear. And then the final point I will make is that be a fighter for norms, right? For all these things that we're talking about, don't let yourself get hijacked. As I said, I believe that these ideas, that humility, empathy, restraint, are all part of what we used to call character. It's a good way to live life, I think. And the only way it's going to help our public discourse is that if enough of us choose to live our lives that way, become examples and models for other people, and hold up those who also do that, that we will return the discourse to a better place. And that's not just some nicety, if you really believe that discourse and ideas are sharpened through discourse, and that that's the purpose of a democracy. Because when you don't sharpen them through discourse, and people think the route to success is closed off through discourse and through the political system, then they go outside the political system. They take things into their own hands. And we saw that happen on January 6th. So give space and grace to those you disagree with, listen, restrain judgment, don't pile on. And I'm really glad that you all are showing that tonight, because so far no one has shouted, resign. We'll do a few. Okay.
So we'll turn on our mics. Well, you anticipated many of the questions submitted by our community and the students who wanted very practical advice about how to find a different way through political discourse. And I will say Ignatius of Loyola would be very proud of everything you described as discernment. I wonder about, I asked my 93-year-old Uncle Joe is a Jesuit priest. I asked him once, what is the most startling thing you've seen in your almost century? And he said, what has changed the most? He said, instant communication. And I wonder about the role of media in changing everything in our political discourse, and is there a way back from what it has become?
I don't think so. I'd like to think there's a way back. I mean, I think there will be a kind of flight to quality, and we actually see some of that now, which is that we find in our research, and I think YouTube has found this as well, that some of the most popular videos outside of the bilge are long-form videos of interesting topics, and that whatever that age range is, 25 to 35, are watching those. Long, and we found this when I was in the magazine world, that you kind of had two ends of the spectrum, that people loved reading anything that was under 100 words or 40,000 words, and that there was a real market for that second piece. But is it a market big enough to overcome all the other forces? I mean, when we do a broadcast or when I write a story, I'm not fighting just against the other magazines or the other news broadcasts. I'm fighting against TikTok. I'm fighting against the notification from your daily Bible app that tells you it's time to read, whatever, Corinthians. So the number of incursions that I talked about before are now something that all media has to fight for, and many of them have chosen to compete by scaring the bejesus out of or trying to keep the attention of the viewers, not by respecting the attention of the viewers, but by agitating it. You may have seen some claims of breaking news that were not, in fact, breaking news. So I think that, I think that we have to all keep making the case for the things I talked about, and hope that people get sick of the other side. There are a lot of people who have turned off from the political system because they don't see themselves or their lives in it. And now, so those people are ready, they're there. You just have to provide them with something to find attractive that will speak to their lives and not agitate them. So tune in every night at 6:30.
Speaking of the Bible app, faith is this powerful weapon, often used for good or for ill. And it can be the voice that cuts through political rationalizations, as it was for John Lewis in the Civil Rights Movement. What role do you see it playing now, or is it diminishing in power altogether?
Well, it plays a super strong role on the right in the politics of the right. One of the things that surprised me the most is that I came up in political coverage covering the Republican Party. It just happened that way because when I was at Time Magazine, Bill Clinton was in the White House, so you had White House correspondents covering the Democrat, and then I wasn't a White House correspondent, so I covered the candidates in 1996, which was the first real campaign that I covered. And so I ended up covering Republicans all the way up, and I particularly covered the Bush White House. And Bush's connection with evangelical Christians is that he was one of them. There were a lot of people who mocked him when he was asked who the political philosopher, I might be mangling this slightly, but which political philosopher he was influenced by the most, and he said Jesus Christ. And so there were a lot of people who thought that was amusing, except for all the evangelicals and people who built their lives around the teachings and truth of Jesus Christ. So so I thought, okay, that's the evangelical vote in the Republican Party. And then there was at the end of the race in 2000, it was disclosed that George W. Bush had a drunk driving arrest, and there was a conventional wisdom, which might even be true, but that he lost a bunch of evangelical votes because his personal behavior was inconsistent with their view of what a president should be. So in 2015 and 2016, I thought, well, those voters who weren't even going to let a guy off the hook for a drunk driving incident when he was a stupid teenager, they're never going to vote for Donald Trump because both his personal and expressed values are inconsistent with the people that I've been talking to for 20 years. So I was totally wrong about that. In South Carolina, which is a heavily evangelical state in the Republican primary, where George W. Bush won and where his brother, Jeb Bush, should have done well, not only did Donald Trump beat Jeb Bush, he beat Jeb Bush after a debate in which he said that George Bush should have been impeached because he lied about the Iraq War. Now, that's not a religious position, but presumably if George W. Bush had that strength in the evangelical community, that'd be a mean thing to say about somebody they like. He won the evangelicals, I think, by 70% of the vote in South Carolina. So I was surprised that all the things I'd heard for 20 years about there were a whole host of evangelicals I covered who wanted to get out of the political system because they thought the bargain that you had to make for your faith in order to work in the political system was too worldly, was absolutely antithetical to the things around which they'd centered their lives. So that surprised me a great deal, and that obviously has only gotten more powerful in the Republican Party. The Democratic Party has a religious element for sure, but it's not as central and driving and really passionate as it is on the right.
So you reminded us that in our history, it's been bad before, that we've dealt with political violence of ways that progress has never been inevitable, it's been fought for. And when,
Creepy me.
yeah. The Congressman Lewis, in addition to being stunning in every way, also was willing to meet with 19-year-old interns on the Hill. And I asked him about that picture, which he had on his desk, about to get his skull cracked open at Selma. Said, how were you not afraid? And he told me, of course I was afraid. So how much courage should our students expect to need in the path forward?
Oh, well, if we get into a situation like that, again, think about it. What was he armed with? Just a bunch of ideas. Just the stuff that was in his head. That gave him that courage. It is mind-boggling that his, and obviously not just his. When I was interviewing him, sorry, I'm going off the record. I interviewed him at the African American Museum, which he had helped build. Right? Think about this, it's amazing. A guy who gets put in a hospital for marching for voting rights is the one who ends up getting the African American Museum in Washington where it is, and is able to then hug the first African American president. The scope of his life and the span of his life is amazing. We sat at the lunch counter inside the museum, and there are pictures up on the wall of various leaders and pictures from the civil rights movement. And he would name the various people as the pictures were kind of being cast up on the wall and going through these various, and he would name all the ones that had died in the struggle. And that people were dying and getting beat and kept up is just, the power of hope, which obviously Lewis wrote about, but, Merton writes quite a lot about too, that through hope, faith becomes real. It's the only thing I know is how to get through those moments is through having hope in something. Or you have to do your homework before that to feel that strongly about an idea that you're willing to face down police and billy clubs and dogs to be propelled by it, which is on the one hand the strength of an idea, it's also how hard you have to work to really believe something that powerfully. I hope you never need that kind of courage, but we need plenty of courage now, to just even uphold those norms that I was talking about earlier. It's a lot easier to just go along. It's a lot easier to say, no, let that person who's saying that incredibly objectionable thing, let them continue. Because as long as the other parts of the three-part system I mentioned are in place, that's the way we get better ideas. That's the way we learn that that person is objectionable. That's the way we sharpen why we think they're objectionable. And when we sharpen that, we might think, I'm not just going to hold this belief. I'm going to act on it now because I've thought it through in a way that makes me viscerally respond to what that person is saying. And I never want to have somebody else have that reaction because of somebody else who says something like that. We have to have, more of those individual conversions to strongly held beliefs based on that journey. And hopefully the people in my business will make that easier by putting real and useful information in front of people that will activate their interest in the big decisions of the day, not cheapen them by trying to just freak them out, because that's our role, is to stir that kind of thinking, not to get people to decide one way or the other, but to stir the thinking and put the elements in front of people in a way that they can engage with those ideas. And escape from the frame that's created for them by social media or by the political system.
So that leads neatly to one last question from a student. Would you recommend becoming a journalist?
Absolutely, unless my kids are listening. Yeah, because we need people with good hearts who see the humanity in others, who want and believe that all that stuff I talked about is actually possible and not just old and outdated. But I also would make a case for it's a brutal business, and the economics of it are not good, and you can have dear friends who lose their jobs because of stuff because more people are watching TikTok than all that careful work you did, and that can be at times depressing. But there's nothing more rewarding than helping somebody understand the scary, weird, unpredictable world that they live in, and it's also an incredible route to joy and wonder and discovery. The world is full of so many amazing things, and you get to wake up every morning and go, that amazing thing. Let me call somebody and ask them about that amazing thing and have them explain it to me. And they now learn through brain scans that there's actually, the brain responds to the receptive, there's a dopamine response to curiosity that's paid off. So it's, it makes you feel good too, if it's not making you feel bad. And the final point I would make is that we kind of all have to be journalists now. I mean, the restraint and aspects of critical thinking and fighting your own biases and seeing the world clearly and whole That's all of our jobs. So you might as well train to be a journalist so that you can, even if you end up becoming something else, you'll have all those tools to be able to, live in our society in a more productive way.
Well, thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for your wisdom and your perspectives. And I hope all of you will join us for a brief reception after this, but we are very grateful. Thank you, John.
So thank you again so much to John Dickerson for that thoughtful speech and insightful conversation. So throughout the year, we'll host events just like this one on topics concerning civic engagement and civil discourse. So please visit the FitzSimons Initiative webpage to keep up with various events throughout the year. You'll see a link later this week in an email. So that concludes tonight's event. Thank you again for joining us.